Hello everyone! Today we're talking about the top 10 worst things about Ultimatum. This is actually the second time I've had to record this video, so we'll get into more about that at the end of this video, but suffice to say, oh boy, I am really sick of Ultimatum. So before we get into this video, I do want to briefly touch on two things. One, if you like this channel, be sure to subscribe to Comic Island and check out our Patreon page in the video description below. Two is what Ultimatum is about, since not everyone might have read this story. So, in brief, there was an alternate line of comics from Marvel that depicted various superheroes and their stories in a modern light. We got Ultimate Spider-Man, Ultimate X-Men, and the Ultimates, their version of the Avengers. It was basically a way of letting fans get into Marvel Comics without having to read decades and decades of content and sort of provide a different take on some classic Marvel stories. And it ran for a good long time. Various people have a lot of different opinions. It hasn't aged well, and a lot of people don't look on Ultimate Comics with a lot of affection, but I still do. That's actually how I got into comics in the first place, and Ultimate Spider-Man is really good for doing that. The other comics haven't aged as well, and I do admit they're flawed, but I still enjoyed them, and I very much enjoyed where the Ultimate comics were going. At the time, I preferred them over the main canon since I understood all of Ultimate comics. I had read all of the Ultimate comics and could have a handle around them in a way I could never possibly hope to do so for the 616 universe. That all changed when Ultimatum came along, one of the first real crossover events between the various Ultimate comics. In it, basically Magneto gets a hold of Thor's hammer Mjolnir and completely annihilates the world. Everyone dies, literally dozens of named characters die before Magneto is finally stopped and killed himself. A lot of bad things happen, New York City is basically drowned, and that's the story. Just a lot of really depressing stuff. Did you guys know that some pretty dark things happened in the early 2000s? Because this comic did, and it's all about that. And that's it. That's literally all there is to the story. That's my plot summary of it. Magneto gets Thor's hammer and kills everybody. That's pretty much it. So, let's get into the worst things about this. Number 10, Jeff Loeb. Ultimatum was written by a comics writer and, I guess, editor or something. Certainly he's an executive now over at Marvel in charge of all their television operations, or at least he was. I don't know if he still is. But Jeff Loeb is the writer of this story, and yeah, he's a huge part of why this comic doesn't work. Honestly, he'd be at number 1 because the writing of Ultimatum is so horrendous, were it not for the fact that his son died of bone cancer right before writing this comic. And that's really dark and terrible, and explains a lot of this comic. And I'm not going to get too much into him or like all of this because that's just unfortunate. That sucks. And Ultimatum becomes a terrible, awful, depressing comic because of that. You can see it in the writing and why it's all about death and misery and destruction. It's a man going through grief, but somebody should have stopped him because it's not very well written. And as we get into everything else that's wrong with this comic, just remember this fact that this is about a man who is going through something genuinely horrible, and we should understand that and kind of put this comic into context. I'm not going to be going too hard on this one in that regard. I'm not going to be making fun of this too much in that regard. This is just a comic that shouldn't have been published, and people other than Jeff Loeb should have done something about it. Remember, he isn't publishing this comic in a vacuum. There's executives and editors above him who could have said or done something to avoid this disaster. But they did not.
Oh, my life! Michael! What's wrong? Everything is wrong, Dwight!
Number 9. Talented art flushed down the toilet. So Ultimatum features a very talented artist being paired up with Jeff Loeb's writing. David Finch is awesome and does some of the best and most realistic artwork in superhero comics these days. He's really great, and I love a lot of his work. Even here, the Ultimatum comics are well drawn, but what David Finch is being asked to draw is frigging awful and completely unacceptable. It just looks terrible and is not worth our time at all. I can't even show half of this imagery on YouTube without risking this video being pulled in some form or another, so I won't.
This is bullshit.
Number 8. Gross-ass imagery. Following right up on that is the fact that we're seeing people being torn to shreds, being violently killed. Doctor Strange turns purple and explodes thanks to Dormammu's magic. Something about this could work, where all these superheroes are suddenly and shockingly dying this violent death. I've seen it before in, like, What If comics and stuff like that. I actually have a pretty high threshold of tolerance for gore and viscera. My life, which hasn't been like super tragic, but between growing up on a farm, working in restaurants, and working in an animal research lab, however temporarily and on like an educational basis, I've seen enough. I really don't get grossed out that easily by things, and I think my issue with Ultimatum and how it depicts gore is less that it's gross, it's the context in which it's being depicted. And I'm not being like, you know, shaking my hand about content or wringing my hand about what's appropriate or not appropriate for children. This comic is obviously not appropriate for children. I think the issue is far deeper than that.
But it's not fair! It's not fair! I should feel ill when I hear lovely, lovely, lovely bad!
Number 7. Cannibalism. So there's a sequence in Ultimatum that I think defines this story really well, and if you haven't gotten how bad this thing is yet, maybe this will help. So we have Hawkeye and Ant-Man in New York City. Everyone's drowning and dying, but they're focused on finding Janet, the Wasp, who's gone missing. After a long degree of searching and going through a lot of stuff, they do eventually stumble on her corpse being consumed by the Blob. And in response, Hank loses it and bites off the Blob's head. Number 6. Genocide. So this comic is basically depicting a genocide of the human race. Magneto's done that sort of thing before, but I will always point out how silly it is for writers not to acknowledge how deeply hypocritical that is of his character. Sometimes, like in the movie X2, I feel the writers do a good job at showcasing that hypocrisy, that Magneto's become so twisted in various iterations of this character that he's willing to just wipe people out without a care for the fact that this is what defines him as a person, that he went through this genocide and it shaped his worldview. So for him to turn around and just slaughter humans en masse, even though they haven't done anything wrong, yeah, it doesn't work for Magneto's character. There's a scene where, like, it's implied Magneto has these sexual feelings for Wanda. Oh, that's, by the way, why Magneto's killing everybody. I guess I forgot to mention that. His kids are killed, and so he gets all upset with the human race. But none of this feels like it's worthy character development for a character like Magneto. In fact, it feels woefully underdeveloped for a character like Magneto, and just comes across as really gross and negligent in terms of writing because of that. Magneto's character is perhaps the worst treated out of all the characters in Ultimatum, and that says something. The things he does, the lines he crosses, the degree and thoroughness of which he slaughters all of his enemies is just upsetting to watch. I forgot that I put Genocide and Magneto as separate entries on this list, but it goes both ways. Not only is he a terrible character, but the Genocide is not something I particularly enjoy watching. There's a situation where that sort of thing is called for, and it enhances the story. Mouse is a good example of that, but if you want a superhero version of it, look at Days of Future Past, or all the stuff where the X-Men are depicted as victims of genocide, and like have to go through this sort of thing. Ultimatum, it feels like, fumbles this to a degree, and a pretty particularly bad one as well. Number 4. Joylessness. So, obviously, as we're getting into a story about death, genocide, and cannibalism, it's a miserable experience, and something you can probably only understand from reading it. We have had a lot of dark Marvel comics in the past, and some of them are excellent, phenomenal reads. But Ultimatum is a chore to get through. It's gross, it's devoid of any humor or fun moments. It doesn't have that spark of life that is present in most superhero stories. And even in the ones without it, those tend to have more of a sense of dark humor or a sense of pacing that keeps you going through the story. Ultimatum's a slog. It's really boring to get through, but also just torturously dark and depressing. A really bad mix of these three things that make it just a terrible read overall.
Where are the turtles? Where are the turtles?
Come on, guys, get out of here.
Where are the turtles?
Number 3. Heroes becoming villains. So in addition to Magneto's character being terrible and doing terrible things, the heroes are also terrible and do terrible things. We've talked about Hank Pym biting the head off of a villain, but that doesn't get into everyone else here. Cyclops, Stephen Strange, the Avengers, the X-Men, a lot of them don't come across as particularly heroic in this story. Things go bad for them and they just snap, equally willing to kill and slaughter Magneto and his Brotherhood for what they've done. I get it, emotions are high, they've slaughtered millions of people and deserve little more than death, but the way that they're acting in this story feels wildly disproportionate to the characters they're supposed to be. This is part of the problem with Ultimate Comics in general, and to a degree a lot of these characters are pretty consistent to their ultimate versions of themselves. You look at something like what Captain America should be versus what he is in the Ultimate Comics, and he comes across lacking. You look at what Logan should be, Cyclops is the same thing. And we're left with this mess. We're left with characters who have gone so far from their original ideas as their 616 counterparts that it's no longer fun to read this. It's no longer a pleasant, enjoyable story. And that gets into number 2, the violent death of everything I'd come to love. So as I was getting into at the beginning of this story, I really liked Ultimate Comics. I haven't been able to hold that opinion up as much as I would like. These comics don't age very well. I can't defend a lot of moments in Ultimate Comics preceding this. But overall, I had liked it. I really enjoyed what was happening right up until this moment. And then all these great characters that I liked following were dead. All these interesting relationships between Spider-Man and Daredevil and the rest of the Avengers were effectively gone. Spider-Man would turn out to live through this story, but to be fair, at the time, at the end of Ultimatum, I didn't think so. They set up that he died too. So we basically had lost everyone worth following, and were left with a story that was effectively dismantled. What had remained of the Ultimate Universe was gone. And we didn't know at the time that they would be creating new characters like Miles Morales and Logan's son and a few others that would become pretty interesting and would eventually be adapted into the 616 universe. But until that time, we were left with this terrible destruction of an entire publication line of Marvel Comics to no gain. It was all over. In one fell swoop, Jeff Loeb destroyed all of these great comics, and I was left with nothing. Less than nothing, because record.
Oh no.
Alright. The number one worst thing about Ultimatum is that it ruined a perfectly good drinking game. See, that's the thing. I talked about at the very beginning of this video that I already tried to film this video once as a drinking game. I gathered 2 of my friends, we all got together, drank a whole bunch of alcohol, and talked about the worst things about Ultimatum. Unfortunately, it was kind of a pilot session to begin with, so it wasn't that well filmed. I had a mic stand in the way for one of my friends, and that really didn't work. And Ben and Allison did a great job overall. They were fun and funny, and it was a pleasant recording experience on the whole.
As you mentioned earlier, the concept can work. It's a very interesting way because we're so used to heroes always winning.
Yeah.
But now that we let the heroes lose, we see what's actually going on. At the end, we think everything's great, but all of a sudden Cyclops gets shot by Quicksilver, like pushing the bullet through his head.
Yeah, that's a good point. There's absolutely no closure in this comic.
Yeah.
From the start, it's just awful.
If they would have given you a little bit more time even, a little bit more backstory, instead of just jumping from death to death to death, if you do not know everything about every character in this story,
yeah,
you're missing out on so much.
But the end result was terrible. because Ultimatum is so dark and so depressing that even though we drank way too much, the story itself sobered us up. The fact that Jeff Loeb went through all these terrible things, and that's why this comic is so dark and depressing, we just kind of simmered out after a while.
So that brings us to the Ultimatum Drinking Games conclusion. I found this easy. I don't know about you guys.
Too bad.
Yeah, like, I didn't know how much drinks or how quickly it was gonna go or how much it would add up, but we went through it pretty easily. I think a huge part of this story is so naturally sobering. We're talking about genocide.
Yeah,
We're
it's kind of
talking-
like you couldn't make it funny.
Well, yeah.
But we've had successful drinking games with terrible stories before. I had a lot of fun reviewing One More Day and getting extremely drunk while doing so. It was amusing, and a lot of people liked that video. I thought the same thing would happen for Ultimatum. It did not, so I apologize to Ben and Allison. They will be back, and we will do another drinking game that will actually work. But yeah, it didn't even work for that. It couldn't even make a good drinking game. Ultimatum was that bad. And yes, I don't know if you guys are going to agree with me making that number one, but it's the freshest wounds that hurt the most. I had kind of gotten over Ultimatum a long time ago, but I was shocked to discover that we couldn't even have fun doing a drinking game out of this, and I had to go back and basically record a traditional top 10 instead, which is what you're all watching now. So thanks for watching. I hate this story and everything about it, so I don't recommend it, but I do recommend, well, I don't know, if you don't know anything about Spider-Man, I definitely recommend Ultimate Spider-Man. It's a great way to get into the character, but if you know about the character, I don't know, most people don't really like that story if they already are familiar with a lot of older Spider-Man comics, so maybe not. I don't know what I recommend. I recommend nothing. But thanks again for watching, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and keep reading comics.